Welcome, Hop Nation, to the Hop Nation podcast. I'm very happy to have a guest today from the Valley, Ashwin Krishnan, who's really the number one expert in cyber morality and a premier expert in cybersecurity. Welcome, Ashwin.
Thanks for having me, Corey.
Thank you. Hopefully this is a more pleasant experience than when I had you come up and visit me here in Canada. Well, I don't know if that story's going to come out today, like the craziness of that. But
I'm never going to forget that, but all good memories.
It was great. Well, for the benefit of the audience, I'm going to read your bio here, and then we'll get into it.
Sure.
Excellent. So, Ashwin Krishnan is the host of Undercover Leaders podcast. He hosts amazing everyday heroes and heroines who lead without fanfare or recognition. As the COO of Uber Knowledge, he hosts tech and cybersecurity leaders on podcasts. He says he is privileged to be working with incredibly talented folks to bring cybersecurity awareness and training to help close the growing skills gap. We have a particular interest in those demographics currently underrepresented in the industry. He's also a tech ethicist, hopefully I said that correct, writer, podcast host, and speaker. He speaks at conferences highlighting the need for a sharper focus on the ethics surrounding the tech industry. He writes articles and blog posts using analogy to simplify technology trends and complex topics like AI and IoT. He enjoys hosting podcasts with CISOs and other industry experts to bring awareness and practical tips to security vendors, enterprises, and consumers. Best of all, he is motivated by identifying everyday leaders and highlighting their goodness and positivity to inspire others. Ashwin's purpose, in a nutshell, is to emphasize, educate, and empower in tech, ethics, and human goodness.
I almost believe that.
You almost believe that.
Yeah.
Well, as someone that knows you, I know you hold those values, and I believe that because I've seen it. And
Thank you.
When you shared to Accelerate Okanagan, to the people in the incubator there, or to the Networking Association meeting here in Kamloops where you spoke to them, we saw that, and we know the great feedback, and a lot of those labels in your bio were things that came out in terms of feedback from those in attendance. So I know you believe it, or you wouldn't put it out there. Your humility is shining through.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. So for the benefit of the listeners, I always like to ask a bit about the founder's story and your motivation for why you're doing what you're doing now. So what is that story?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So I was following the traditional path, quote unquote, if you will, right? Going through the ranks, like you said, in the valley, going up the chain, making sure I have a title and have a bigger group, and then see that looking at the Joneses next door and see whether we have a big enough house or car or so forth, right? And then at some point, something snapped. It was almost, and I look back at the series of things. It wasn't kind of a single incident that caused me to kind of change my course, but it was an awakening that started happening. And one of the things you mentioned was using everyday analogies to drive awareness through complex topics. That was something it's something that just started. And I literally, I'm not saying this with pride. It's just, I can write really fast, and it gives me that outlet to let everyday people know. And I struggle with this because IoT, like you mentioned, we're all, or people who can be sheltered at home are sheltering at home. And we are surrounded by these listening, hearing, watching devices, right? So IoT is not this fanciful thing that somebody came about. It's there. It's your Alexa at home. It's your Nest at home, right?
And Ashwin, just for the benefit of those non-technical people on here, IoT again
is the Internet of Things. Right. So think of it as anything that is connected. And literally these days you have everything from connected TV, to a connected coffee maker, to connected TV app, your refrigerator, and so forth, right?
Right.
So my point being that when I started doing that, I started realizing that people need to know, just like your point. I mean, I made the snafu of assuming people know what IoT means, but even if you forget what IoT is, if you realize the fact that, and I use this analogy in one of my many articles, right? It's, imagine we were in the world where Airbnb was still hot, not where we are right now, where it obviously is having challenges. But imagine a world, and you go to an Airbnb home. And this has happened, right? You can just Google it and you'll figure it out. Is, as a host, you can argue you have the privilege of putting cameras inside your home, right? For quote unquote security reasons.
Right.
Not notifying your guests that you have cameras inside your home is a problem. So you can be a non-tech person and have an Airbnb home, have multiple Airbnb homes with cameras for, let's say, security reasons. But you have crossed that ethical boundary if you do not inform your guests that they are being recorded. Now, but I don't pretend to stand on this high moral ground and say that, hey, this is how things need to happen. I also like to put in, hey, you know what? Be transparent about it. Like, let's say I'm a guest and you're the host, and Corey has informed me as part of our agreement that, hey, you know what? I have these cameras for security reasons. Now, we will ensure that anonymity is maintained. Now, if you agree that we could record the guests or when you're inside the home, when you're renting the property, we will give you 20% off your daily stay. That is transparency. Because now you're telling me that the cameras are there, me and my family could be recorded. You're also telling me that it's going to be obfuscated, our faces and other parts of our system is not going to be visible. But you want to know, for instance, and I could turn that around and say, hey, why does Corey need to know? Because you want to know how many people are drinking coffee. Is the coffee machine being utilized effectively? Is the laundry being used? Now, instead of you asking me those hundreds of questions afterwards, and I don't have the time to remember all those mindless surveys that you have to fill out, who has the time for that, right? So you want to know, what is it that people are using more effectively? What is it that you need to bring in to the fore? So there could be a legit reason as a host for you to do those things. But if you don't do that with transparency, if you don't let me know beforehand, I'm going to feel violated, right? So that was actually one of the stories that I wrote about why transparency and ethics and privacy in IoT is so important as a person-to-person thing, where whether you're traveling, you're staying in somebody's house, what is that experience going to look like, right? So again, long story short, so from that point on, I started getting this urge of saying, hey, I need to try something different. And so along the way, and now it seems so obvious, but hey, once you hit your karma path, I think it always feels that way, is doing what you and I are doing right now, which is talking one-on-one.
Yes.
And I just stumbled into it, right? And again, thankful for Fred Coast, my ex-colleague, VP of Marketing at High Trust, who introduced me to Andy Anderson, who happened to be a podcast host in his own right. And this was RSA 2018, the security conference from 2 years ago. And so Andy told me, hey, Fred has told me that you're in this discovery mode and you'd be a great overflow podcast host. I said, what's an overflow podcast host? He said, I've subscribed to too many guests, and instead of telling them that I can't host them, can you take on some of the burden? And I said, Andy, I haven't done a podcast in my life. He said, no, that's okay. It's like, hey, you can do it. And I said, fine. So that was really kind of the turning point for me, because I was talking, believe it or not, Corey, these were the same people that I would have given an arm and a leg to have a conversation with as part of the vendor community, right? Because I used to build products. I was SVP of products, and hey, talking to a chief information security officer at Home Depot or Bloomingdale. I mean, these are people that I would feel, hey, this is the person I want to talk to.
Those were your peeps.
Those were exactly right. And yet here I am, a nobody, in the podcasting business in this conference. And not only were these people talking to me, but they were opening up like they've never opened up before. So then I was like, something is amiss over here, right? When I was on the vendor side, I would have loved to get your perspective on this. And now I'm not. What gives? And I still remember Simon Gibson asking me the question. He says, look at yourself, Ashwin. It's like, are you going to send me hey, Simon, glad we talked, and we have this new software release, we have this new product, we have this new deal coming out for you. Any such email coming from you right after the podcast gets over and you walk out of the conference room? I said, no. He said, do you have a broader agenda of doing anything besides education? I said, no. He said, there you have your answer, right? Why would I not open up to you? Because you want to have an honest conversation. There is no agenda behind that, but beyond what we and I are talking. And so then I said, okay, so maybe there is something here, right? Maybe there's a gap that exists between the people who are actually deploying security and the ones that are actually building it that could get addressed through these podcasts. So that's kind of how the journey started. And interestingly, where I am right now at Uber Knowledge was also as a result of a podcast I did at the same RSA. So Eve Malin and I connected, and she introduced me to this amazing individual called John Kindervac, who is the founder of Zero Trust. He used to be at Forrester, now he's at Palo Alto Networks. And I still remember this conversation. So it was Eve, John, and I talking, and John says, hey, by the way, do you know this guy called Pradeep Aswani? I said, John, I don't know who you're talking about. He said, no, you should talk to him because there's something about what you're saying that he must resonate with him, right? So that was my non-traditional path of landing my next gig, right? Again, through these conversations of just opening up, showing who you are, showing what you believe, and showing what you really want to help move the needle just a little bit in the world. And that led to Pradeep and I talking, and that's kind of how I landed into the CEO of Uber Knowledge. And in a nutshell, what Uber Knowledge does is the business is really cybersecurity training. And so we deliver training to end users and practitioners and partners of large cybersecurity vendors who we have a business relationship with. So that's on the actual practitioner side, people in the front lines.
Right.
And then I lead with conversations with chief information security officers, chief privacy officers, CIOs on the front end through these podcasts. And it's very, very clear. The podcast is not a monetizable entity. It's not a lead gen. It is a conversation. That is a Chinese wall.
Right.
And very similar to the high order performance that you were talking to your tech customers. One of the things I've realized is, especially in this digital age now more than ever, and having done about 125 podcasts, I know a little bit about how we connect digitally to somebody. And it's not rocket science, but really the three things that I have used consistently is, number one, connect. Right. So if I were to host you on a podcast, and you know me well, so we know each other, so we can get in right on. But let's say I did not know you, and I was going to host you on my podcast. The connect piece can only happen if I have put in effort to understand who you are, what you've done, how you've built your business, what you've tweeted about. And in this day and age, very, very few of us have a personality that doesn't have a social profile. And so I built a social profile, and that's really looking at tweets, LinkedIn's, sometimes even Facebook's, events that you've been at, conversations that you've had, articles you've been quoted in. And that becomes my blueprint. So when I start the conversation with Corey, it's really about, hey, by the way, I noticed that you were quoted in so-and-so magazines saying this. Now, immediately, it becomes about you. It's not my podcast. It's not about my agenda. It's really starting a conversation from your point of view, and that immediately builds that trust relationship.
Right. And I want to ask a question because
sure.
The examples in terms of the research and getting the background for that was all social media-based platforms, not
Correct.
the company website. Because historically, most people went to the company website first and the About Us and about the organization. And with sales training and development, that's where they tell you to start. And I'm like, well, really? Yeah. So it's interesting.
So I don't do that at all. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned that I have never, ever been to a company's website for any one of my guests. It's almost irrelevant for me, right? Because ultimately there's a human being. I mean, yes, in the future when there are bots handling these sales conversations, things will be different, right? Maybe bots have personalities, who knows, right? But as long as a human being in the equation, and people talk about it now when they're talking about, hey, how do you reach a prospect digitally? It's like, hey, look at their family. But again, there is this ethics piece over here, right? You're not telling them something that they have not already spoken to the world about, which means I'm not going to troll you on Facebook where you're talking to a small community and talk about your kids and how they are homeschooled and all that. That's neither here nor there. I'm interested in the individual who is talking to the market, talking to the press, talking to as a keynote speaker at an event, or making a comment on LinkedIn. That's fair game, right? So again, you have to be really, really careful of saying, okay, yes, you need to understand the person, but don't cross that boundary where it starts to get too close.
Right.
And so for me, that's the connect piece. Now, the other piece of it is the second C is the convey piece, right? Okay, what am I bringing to the table? Do I have the best product? I mean, like I said, I talked about training myself, which is what we do. You could offer services, you could offer other aspects of your business. But the problem with the convey piece is if you either ignore the connect or rush through the connect. Like I'll give you one example, right? And I posted this about on LinkedIn 3 days ago because it just caused me to, this is wrong, right? So I had signed up for a virtual event, right? Hey, that's the only kinds of events that exist these days, right? And I had oversubscribed the number of things I had to do that day, so I never attended the event. Guess what? My email is with the event organizers and all the sponsors for that event. So I start getting these emails, right? I hit delete. And one of these emails said, I was given your name by so-and-so in my organization because you failed to attend our event. That was the first line.
That was the first line?
That was the first line of the email, right? So I thought to myself, you are poking fingers at me for not attending your event, and you're opening up your organization structure, who gave you my name. None of that even matters. And now you think I'm going to be interested?
Yeah.
Then I said, okay.
Or it does matter, exactly. But it's negative marketing and collateral and relational building.
So I said, okay, so let me hold my go, and went through that, right? And say, okay, that's what the first thing. And second is the convey piece, right? So you're exactly to your point. You're not connecting, you're disconnecting with me, and now you're conveying, hey, by the way, we have the best thing for security officers to make sure the data is safe and all that. None of that matters to me anyway. And then the last one was, here is my Calendly link for you to connect with me. So at that point, I paused, right? Which is, okay, now you're telling me that I need to hit on a link so that I can get on your precious calendar and find some time with you, right? And the kicker at the bottom line, this goes back to my tech ethics piece, is in really small font, in almost gray color, if you wish to unsubscribe to future emails, click here. So that's what I kind of posted on LinkedIn saying, hey, this is wrong from many, many different fonts, right? What would have got to me, and I'm sure it'll get to many people, is if you had put this, I am never, ever going to send you another email again in bold if I do not hear back from you. That's empathy. Right, but now you're doing which nobody else does, right? Which is
and right start off the first line. Go exactly. Notice that you weren't able to attend the meeting. I hope everything is okay.
Exactly right. So
given the current state of the world and where we're at. I hope everything's okay.
And that's a great first connect. And right after that,
we can offer you the information
right.
in a format,
that is more suitable to you.
Know.
Right, exactly. And if we don't hear back from you, we will never ever email you again. Right. There you have me, right? You're connected. Yeah. Now it's almost the other way around, which is I'm intrigued by what is it that you actually do, which isn't that what you really want? You want the person to actually feel a little bit more.
That's the point excited. Of getting them on the call.
It's so that's the whole concept behind that. And again, this is going back to yes, we're all hurting, right? Whether it's financially, whether it's losing a loved one, whether it's dealing with health issues, dealing with people who've lost jobs. I know a good ex-colleague of mine, she lost her husband 9 months ago. She lost her job last week, and she has 2 kids, right? So yes, there is stress in the system, right? And there's no 2 ways about it. But within that, you still have to operate knowing that you want to connect because people are distracted. So now more than ever, the connect piece needs to really get amplified, because what you convey in terms of business or services, that is secondary, if at all, right? The third con, which I found actually very, very interesting, is the convince piece. And so this is one where I didn't realize that you cannot convince another person to buy a product, right? They have to convince themselves. They have to come to that point of actually getting to a situation where they feel that here is something I need to reach out to. Here is somebody that I need to. So I think that those 3 phases of being able to connect, convey, and then really be able to convince, not you convincing them, but they convincing themselves that
right, helping people to buy versus being sold to.
Correct, exactly, right. And so that especially, and then going back to what we talked about earlier, which is the podcasting has given me tremendous insight, right? And I've told you this many times, Corey. It still shocks me that within 20-25 minutes of having an honest conversation, using the social profile, starting with that person, ending with that person, results in a relationship that goes on for years together.
Yes.
And there is, and we talk about this. Hey, digital relationships are flaky, they're fragile, and I'd say no, far from it. Right? I'm living proof of that. Which is, hey, I mean, off the 125 podcasts, I would have probably met 5%, 10% at best, face to face. The rest are all virtual. And I kid you not, I have their numbers in this phone. They're on LinkedIn, and 90% of them will respond to me within 24 to 48 hours, and vice versa. Right? It's a relationship.
And that's amazing, because as my friend, Ed Wallace talks about, who runs Relational Capital Group, it's the relational piece. And you and I talked about the HOT, the humanization of technology, because
exactly.
Behind all AI, behind all data analytics, all tech stuff are people. Even
Correct.
with, if everything goes to a bot, there's a human on the other end that the bot's going to. So we can't get away from the human factor. And this whole idea of, we're going to all be replaced. No, the point of all of it is to reach humans in an efficient, different way, whatever. But there's a humanization of technology. And we've even talked about how there's a reversion happening in some circles where there's a revolt against technology and coming back to the human interaction. And we can see that now under this
I was about to say
coronavirus, where we're all leveraging technology to a level that most of us haven't had to do on a consistent basis.
Correct.
And there's this hunger to bring back the human element and that personal connection.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. One of the questions I have for you, and given your background and experience in this, is with this situation being in a world pandemic, what are some of the things we're seeing in terms of new challenges or new answers to cybersecurity and cyber morality in the coronavirus pandemic environment?
Yeah, it's a great question, and this is precisely one of the topics of interest in my conversations with CISOs, particularly over the last month, 2 months, right now, right?
For sure.
So one thing which is more of a business outcome, right? One of the CISOs I was speaking to, he was talking about the fact that they've been measuring productivity once everybody was home, and they were, this is a cloud-first company, but even so, they had physical offices that employees would come into. Now it's cloud and it's remote. And they're looking at email, they're looking at Slack, looking at Zoom, and then they did a impromptu poll of the employees in terms of to measure the efficiency levels, right? In terms of are the meetings more productive by not spending time on commute? Are you able to get more done? And universally, the answer was yes. So now the CISO, and working with his CIO, they already have a plan together. They're going to present to the board, suggesting that they cut down real estate by 80%. Because 80% of people can continue working from home, and we have higher levels of efficiency, and people are also feeling more connected. So it's kind of so that's one aspect of it, right? A forward-looking thought process of a CISO and CIO coming together and making the right decisions for that business in terms of what does a post-pandemic world look like. On the other side, from a security-only perspective, and this again, I wouldn't have even imagined this, but every corporation is now a guest in your home, whether it's through the company-issued laptop, whether it's through a Zoom account. And so imagine you and I are talking, and I have some drug dealing going on in the background, and you're my employer, and we're having a Zoom conversation. Now, suddenly Corey has seen something in my home that's being recorded on company property. But this is my home.
Right.
This is my laptop. It's a company Zoom account, and you've just intruded into my home.
Yeah.
So these are questions.
Even something as simple as disciplining children.
Exactly.
Raising
right?
a voice to someone.
And so, if you're my manager, you see me admonishing my daughter, and then you're just like, oh, you've suddenly seen a side of me that you didn't even know of for maybe many, many years that we've worked together. How is that going to affect my performance rating? How are you going to look at me differently? Right. So, and these are kind of partly touchy-feely topics, but partly it's also there's gray area that is never had to be looked into, right? So that's one piece of it. The other aspect, like we talked about earlier, is because there's much more reliance on the whole digital world, there is also the propensity, we touched about this a little bit earlier, about intruders in the home. And I'm using IoT as a definition of intruder. Yes. But imagine you and I are talking, and again, you're giving me a performance appraisal, and I have Siri or Google Home or Alexa, doesn't matter, that's picking up on keywords and recording it. Now that's my intruder in my home, but it's recording a conversation that you and I are having for business purposes, right? Or even worse, let's say we're a public company and you're the CEO, I'm the CFO, and I'm telling you our pre-earnings data, and that's being recorded. So these are things that have not been in the forefront because for most companies, the percentage of people at home consistently is a much smaller number than obviously the numbers we're seeing right now. So therefore, the risk area is a lot larger. It's always been an issue, but it has never got to that amplification that it is today. And so therefore, that's another aspect of as we go down this path, what's the impact that's going to see, right? Lastly, I think this is more about the dependence on technology that we talked about earlier, right? The issue of where do lines get drawn? And I was talking to somebody else the other day, right? And he was saying he found it so much easier just physically going into work because people would give him the luxury of, hey, he has a long commute, and if he gets home by 6:37, let's try not to disturb him. Now he has a team in India, he has a team in Israel, he has a team in the US. It's like, hey, the boss is on all the time. He's not commuting, right? So yeah, let's mag him up over Slack. Let's set up a Zoom meeting. So
the amount of hours that I find
it's just
I'm working as well as people I'm talking to in the virtual environment. If we thought accessibility was a big thing before this, it's now went poof.
Correct. So that's the other aspect. And again, it doesn't really fit into the security piece of things, but imagine if you have to be on 12 hours instead of 8 hours. Your ability to understand what is a phishing email versus what is not. Your ability to turn off video when you leave a Zoom session, and everything takes a hit, right? So productivity is one thing, but even the awareness piece, even for somebody who is security savvy, is going to be impacted. So again, the CISO's role starts to take on a much, much bigger footprint right now in terms of what he or she needs to be aware of and what influence they need to have on not just the CIO, but the lines of businesses, HR even, in terms of, hey, yes, we need to ensure, otherwise this risk level suddenly starts to go up.
Agreed. So now with the changes we've seen in that industry, but you're living in the Valley. I mean, it's been the buzz, like it's the area that's always kind of happening and hopping. What's the current state of affairs in the Valley and this hub, given the current situation? You know, I hear kind of mixed. Like, we know that there's some companies that are just thriving right now and have been able to pivot and see opportunities, or are just in an industry that benefits, like Zoom, for instance. Right. I mean, we've seen explosive growth for them because of the environment, but in general, where's the Valley at in the current environment?
I think it really comes down to how you can pivot, right? And the pivot, again, goes back to how connected are you? And so it's almost like, imagine you were selling software or hardware, doesn't matter, right? You go in, you have a yearly target, you meet your goals halfway through the year, you've got your sales quota multiple, everybody's happy, and then you're on autopilot for the remainder 6 months until renewal time comes up or something else happens, right? It's very hard to pivot if that's been your mentality, because literally keeping your pulse on the market, keeping a pulse on the customer, what's changed in the environment. I mean, I'll give you a simple example, right? So let's say you're a startup or a mid-sized company that's been, let's say bulk of your revenues is coming from financial services, right? So that's your sector. And you've been doing reasonably well. Now, one of the CISOs I spoke to, right, and he was telling me, and I never did this myself, so I'm equally guilty when I was a vendor, is he says, out of the 30 or 40 vendors that they had in security, I mean, they're a large company, right? He said, except for one, right? One out of that 40 would actually show up to conferences where the focus was on financial services, right? So he says, I'm in an industry of financial services. These security vendors are selling to me, and 39 out of the 40 would only show up in security conferences.
Wow. So not even a financial conference.
Yeah. So it's like you're selling to financial services, but unless you know how my industry is changing. And he was talking about blockchain. He was talking about just the whole fintech and the upheaval that's going through that. This one company individual actually show up to conferences. It used to be, and they were much smaller conferences than these mega security conferences, right? And he says she would come away with so much more insight into what's happening in my industry, and that would circulate back. So next time a sales or a partner conversation would happen, hey, by the way, we just heard that blah is happening in your industry. We were thinking about how we could help with that change. And so he was saying, so going back to your question, I think a lot of these people who've been able to pivot are really clued in, and they're able to assess what's going on way before. One of my other guests, and he was telling me about how in Jan of this year, they were actually talking about a true pandemic response. Everything from, hey, nobody's home, what does it mean? So they did the full simulation run. Are tech people going to be inundated if the remote access goes down? Is our cloud usage going to be able to scale? And they had full metrics in place back in Jan, right? And he said, come March, we were like ready to go. But he says that takes a lot of culture to be able to, because it's like, hey, no one wants to hear bad news, right? And it's like, oh, what if? It's like, but he says you have to look at this as business continuity, and you have to look at this as, and so he says it takes a lot of time and effort to do that. So to your question, I think the businesses that have been able to not just understand how to manage, but also be able to start pivoting, like the scissors example I told you earlier about,
yes,
thinking forward. And the ones, I mean, certain businesses, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, yes, whether it's Airbnb, whether it's restaurant businesses, take home, even things like Uber and others, I mean, they're struggling, right? I mean, you're in an industry that it's hard to suddenly pivot. But for others, B2B in particular, I think has the challenge has been not spending enough time connecting. So therefore now you have to convey your message and you don't even know what the connection is and how you're, like in FinServe, the fintech industry is like, if this particular startup or I don't know, startup or large company, but regardless, they could have a much better sense as to what's happening over there, and they already had contacts, they knew the conference organizers, they could understand better, and therefore their ability to pivot is obviously a lot higher. So overall, I'd say we're in the same mess as everybody else when it comes to working from home and not being able to physically meet people and all that. But that being said, I think the larger companies are doing reasonably okay, as long as your vertical has been affected by the Googles of the world, the Facebooks, the Apples. They've been able to, and again, tech is in their favor because they've built the stuff. You mentioned AI and ML and data, so they have the ability to monitor and be able to respond a lot better. I think the smaller startups, it is much more challenging. And
we know going into the current situation that there's a lot of individuals or businesses that were, weeks or, a month or two away from being insolvent.
Correct.
So this is exposing that risk.
It is. Yeah.
Those that were innovative, either had a cash cushion and were conservative, are benefiting and doing better. And those that were focused on doing business differently, I think, and having those relationships and that at a deeper level that weren't just transactional.
Correct.
Were able to pivot and leverage those relationships upward. Whereas those that got caught in the commodity trap are really feeling it. And also, I think, the small business, certain industries, airlines, hotels, hospitality, it doesn't matter what sort of prep you had before. You're feeling an adjustment and hopefully figuring out some sort of pivot, but it's not the same. There's, we can't deny that certain industries are feeling it more than others, but
yeah, no, it's very true. In fact, talking about pivot, one of my guests earlier today on my Undercover Leaders podcast was a person by name Sammy Cater, and Sammy is a self-esteem and confidence coach for kids, right? Excellent. And he thrives in physically going to schools. He had 150 schools that he used to physically go to, and he had it all mapped out. He's been doing it for many years. He had the entire school year mapped out and who he was going to. And then come March 13th, everything shut down. So guess what he does? He goes online, but not just that he goes online, because what he has done for these schools and these kids in particular is so important, and the impact has been so profound that the principals and teachers were reaching out to him saying, hey, kids are at home, they need Sammy more than ever, you got to do something. So the guy puts a goal. He puts a goal out there saying, I think it was a week out, he's going to start doing YouTube live. And he went to all his customers, the school districts, and said, Sammy Cater is going to be live. Have at it, right? And he went live, and he said it was miserable experience because he was with his mom. The Wi-Fi was bad. What does he do? He apologizes, says that next time the experience is going to be better and it's going to get better from there. And literally, he says from March till now, they've done 40 videos already.
Wow.
Every day, 1 p.m., 5 days a week, it's sunny. Right? So talking about pivoting, here is an example of somebody who thrives on this experience of seeing kids every single day. And now he just says, you know what, I just visualize one of my students looking at the camera, and I feel and I respond, right? And so he's like clockwork. So it's amazing, right? Just talking about somebody who's been able to make that shift. And he says, I've never had a big social presence. I never knew what YouTube Live meant, but he's killing it, right? But also, I think the point of it, which is again going back to your question, is he's had the humility and he's had the courage to accept the fact that he's not going to get it right the first time. And pivoting is constant, right? Okay, so what did I do wrong? Maybe did I oversubscribe? Did I have enough bandwidth? Do I need professional video camera, right? What brings the right experience to my end clients? And then he says, I could have never reached this kind of audience.
And that's the other thing. I think there's greater tolerance for a rawness and imperfections and stuff right now. We're all living it. There's stuff that happens. I'm finding there's, early on there was 3 types. There was those that were using the interruption of the current state as a chance to just get some breathing room and slow down kind of and assess. But after a certain time, it comes down to two types is what I see. And it's those that are looking at the situation that it really is imposed on us. And the choice that's made is either to look at it and use it as an excuse for complacency and look at all that's wrong and really bitch and complain and not do anything. And then there's the other side that they're saying, looking at it and going, okay, this is different, assessing and looking for the opportunities in it, and opportunities to serve, because right now it has to be about serving and bringing value, because we're all probably hypersensitive and worn out of this idea, going back to your earlier comment of being sold to versus helping buy or solve issues. So if you're having conversations that are more in the bringing value or serving something, but it's pivoting because you can't be tied to how you've always done things. And as a trainer, I'm used to big events and going out and speaking and training. Well, that was killed. Right. But before we went live and recorded, I was telling you some of the stuff. That's all virtual. We used to be about 30% virtual and 70% face-to-face. Right now, we're 100% virtual. It's taken redoing the contracts and getting new POs to get it to go virtual. Yep. And these companies are loving it because, one, it's saving tens of millions of dollars in terms of travel, hotels. And this, when you go to a conference or fly in for these big events, with the companies, at least 50% of that motivation is it's the trip and, the different environment and the social side of it to connect.
Yes.
And yes, there's training. Yes, there's this accountability, but it's almost secondary to this other side. So
the experience, we all, exactly.
Yeah. So interesting. I want to ask about certain success habits and high performance habits you have. You're a guy that's extremely busy and high demand. And, I'm not one that, buys into the idea of balance in terms of equality and that. But I know you do certain things that are your success habits. What are some of your high performance habits?
So I'd say the one that is consistently over and above every single thing is, again, going back to what Sammy did, is pushing boundaries, knowing that you won't get it right the first time, may not be the second time, may not be the third time, but that shouldn't stop you from pushing boundaries. And
so getting out of your comfort zone.
It's just, allowing yourself to discomfort. I mean, that's something my MBA professor taught me. It's just, I mean, the phrase is so powerful. Allow yourself the discomfort. So the allow piece is being gentle on yourself.
Yeah. And Joe DeSena, who was on our podcast, the CEO for Spartan Race, so obstacle course, talks about forced adversity. We need to create a forced adversity, and that's by getting outside.
And that's I think the single most important thing is to kind of, because that then leads to, so like what Sammy was saying on the podcast, which is, okay, the first YouTube was bad. What do I need to improve on? So now you've set yourself that goal, because what ends up happening, at least my own example is, I can read these books, right? The 7 Habits of Success. And these are great books. And some people can literally look at it and start living it. Yes. In my case, I need to feel it, right? And the only way I can feel it is by failing. And the only way I can fail is by stretching, right? So for me, it has to be experiential, right? And even the podcast, like I said, I stumbled into it, right? But compare my first podcast to my last podcast, right? Which is, I didn't build a social profile for my first guest, nor my second guest, nor my third guest. And then I started realizing it's like, I'm doing something wrong.
But right? I want to go back to that comment. You're saying you kind of stumbled into it. And I would almost argue that you were doing a lot of things at the time that opportunity presented itself that literally manifested that to come into existence. And you were open to opportunities, and when opportunities present themselves, you were quick to recognize them and actually do something about it. Because I know you and I talked about this on a trip we did, that the majority of people, when presented with an opportunity, just want something for nothing, and there's this entitlement mentality.
Correct.
And very few people will take action to do something when presented with an opportunity.
That's absolutely a great point. So I was midway through my journey. The other piece that I think is equally important, if not more, is the need to give back. And again, sometimes this giving back takes on, it's like I'll get to a certain point, then I'll start giving back. I'll give you a simple example, right? So for me, I'm hardwired right now. If I meet somebody new for the first time, once that conversation ends, who do I know that will benefit from knowing that person, right? So it's almost like it's a simple thing, right? You're just connecting people, but it's a lot more than that, because now I can rattle off between 10 or 20 people who are steeped in tech ethics and privacy, right?
Yes.
And so for me, it doesn't seem fair that I know them, but they may or may not know each other, right? So for me, that connection as an example, right? And there are lots of other ways, right? I talked about this person earlier before the podcast started, about an individual who's lost her spouse and then lost her job, and but I was connecting with her even before. Now it's like, okay, so I'm connecting with the desire to help more so than ever before, right? But the flip side to that is, and you know this and I know this, and we know people who reach out, and when they reach out, there's an agenda.
Yeah, right? We can smell it.
You can smell it at a
on
distance.
Their breath.
Exactly. So what I've realized along the journey is, and this virus has caused most people to realize this, is that time is short, right? We don't know whether you have a day or an hour, 10 years, 20 years, who knows, right? How are you spending that time, and who are you spending it with? has taken on such monstrous focus, right? So for me, when I talk about these habits, focusing on yourself, pushing the boundaries, giving back, and then the counter to that is just how are you spending your time? Who are you spending it with?
Yeah.
What objectives are you spending it on? Right? I think,
where are your priorities?
where are your priorities? I think
Do you even know what they are? That's the beauty of this current environment.
Right.
Like what you thought were priorities has changed, because at the end of the day, we know that health is one in a time like this that gets exposed. Relationships and connectedness to others,
correct,
has been exposed, because when those are removed from the equation and we feel and experience it, we see how much of the things we take for granted in terms of priorities. And crises have a great way of exposing that.
All of those. No, that's very, very true. So so those would be really my kind of blueprint, if you will.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I'm conscious of time, and I don't want to, because you're a busy guy, we'll have to have you back, because I want to get into the IPOP stuff, the In Pursuit of Purpose. And there's some great stories and examples that you have, the bird story. I want leaders, the networking group, love that, when, we had you as a speaker there, and the United Airlines story that
we're still friends.
Exactly. Like, these are really great stories that show what we're ending this podcast with. So there almost needs to be a part 2, to get into the whole purpose and this, what I call the higher order of performance. So those are things at the subconscious, or, within at the unconscious and subconscious level within us, the values, beliefs, attitudes, and that really drive us as humans and connect us at a higher level than the things, and I have a vision of the iceberg. The things we see are that 20% above the surface, but, we've been able to, through conversation, dig into below that. And I'd love, if you're open to it, to have
absolutely
part 2 of the purpose stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll do anytime, Corey.
Sounds good. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Ashwin, and love to have you back. I'll connect with you here offline.
All right. Thank you, Corey, for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Hop Nation Podcast. Please feel free to share. And if there's any guests or people that you'd like to see on the show, please reach out and connect with us. Thank you.